In this video, I'll turn this glass tank into a stunning drip wall moss paludarium. I'm going to use this tank that I built myself from an old aquarium. The plan is to have water slowly dripping down from the top of the tank into an open section of water at the front. Let's get straight into creating this, starting with the rocks that I'm going to use. These are maple leaf rocks and they've got some absolutely stunning detail. The purpose of these two pieces is to create a barrier between the land and water area. After a bit of trial and error, I've come up with this placement that I think will work quite well. It obviously looks a bit boring as it is, so let's improve the hardscape with some wood. I've got a few different pieces to choose from, so I'm going to take some time and try and find a layout that I'm happy with. This is spiderwood, but there's a bunch of different options you can choose from which will all achieve a different look. At the end of the day, it comes down to your personal preference and the kind of layout that you're trying to create. This is what I've settled on and I really like how it looks. Before moving on to the next step, I need to secure the wood to the rocks. To do this, I'm simply going to use some super glue. Now that it's nice and sturdy, I can move on to the next step. I'm going to use this expanding foam to build a background behind the wood and rocks. If I didn't glue the wood down, the foam would likely push it out of the way as it expands and dries. It's been over 24 hours and the foam is fully dried and ready to be carved down. To carve the foam, I'll simply use my fingers to rip off pieces. The goal is to shape it a bit more naturally, but I won't spend too much time on it as it's all going to be covered in moss and plants anyway. With the foam fully carved down, I'm going to add some more maple leaf rocks higher up the background. These will add some nice detail to the scape and they'll stand out really well once the entire background is covered in moss and plants. I definitely don't want them tumbling down and cracking the glass, so I'm going to glue them in place. At this point, you might be wondering how the water's going to flow down over the background. I'll be using this DIY mini canister filter to pull water from the front and push it out at the top of the background where it can slowly drip down. There's a tutorial on this channel showing you exactly how to make this filter in case you're interested. For this system to work properly, it's going to need some pipe work, so let's start by making the intake. This is a plastic drinking straw, and after taking some measurements, I'm blocking up one end with some tape. Next, I'm squeezing on a funnel and then filling the entire straw with some fine sand. Giving it a few taps helps the sand compress, which will give a better result in the end. I can now tape the end, blocking the sand inside before starting to shape. To shape the straw, I'm going to use a lighter and this jig, which you can probably tell I made myself. I'm using the lighter to gradually heat up the area of the straw that I want to bend. Now it's nice and flexible, I can take it to the jig and bend it in half. After about a minute, the plastic has hardened up and it's nice and strong. I'm now placing it back inside the tank and taking another measurement, which I'm then going to bend 90 degrees using the same method as before. That's this piece fully shaped, so I can now take off the tape and pour out the sand. I'm using a sharp blade to cut off the excess as it is a bit long. The reason I've added this 90-degree angle is to allow me to attach the tubing much easier. To finish off the intake, I'm going to cut some small slots where it can pull the water in. After placing on some tape, I'm making a few marks where I'm going to cut. Next is the tedious process of cutting 1/3 of the way into the straw on all the lines that I've made. This would probably be easier with a smaller saw, but you've got to work with what you got. The slots have been cut out, but it is a bit messy, so I'm going to tidy it up with a sharp blade. Running it under a flame for a second or two helps give it a nice clean finish. After adding a cap on the end and some suction cups to attach it to the glass, the intake is complete. The next task is to work on the output tube, which is going to be a spray bar that slowly drips water down the background. Once again, I'm using a long plastic straw and shaping it using the same method as I did earlier. As you can see, I've made some tight bends which makes it fit nice and neatly around the back of the tank. The next step is to make lots of small holes where the water can drip out. The easiest way of doing this is going to be melting holes into the plastic with this screwdriver. It's certainly not the neatest, but it should do the job just fine. I'm plugging up the end by wedging in some filter foam, and then it's time to get it attached in place. With the intake and output complete, I'm going to work on the decorative sand in the foreground. In these tubs I've got some fine sand, some small pea gravel and some larger pea gravel. I'm firstly going to add the fine sand. A paintbrush comes in handy to spread it out throughout the scape. Next I'm adding the small pea gravel followed by the larger pieces. By mixing these different elements together, it helps create a natural looking foreground. Before adding any moss or plants, I'm going to install the canister filter and get the water flowing down the background. I'm connecting the filter to the pipes with some silicone tubing and then filling it up to prime it. Now I'm filling up the tank with water before turning on the pump. It's flowing absolutely perfectly, which is great to see on the first attempt, and the pump is also super quiet, which is definitely an added benefit. Usually when creating an expanding foam background like this one, I'd cover the entire thing in some silicone and something like cocoa fibre, but for this build I want to try something different. What I'm going to do instead is cover all the exposed foam with some live moss. I found all these pieces outside and I really love their vibrant green pillow-like appearance. To plant the moss, I'm simply placing it in the flow of the dripping water. This should keep it hydrated and allow it to grow out in the open air. As this moss is straight from outside, it's going to be an experiment to see how it gets on. Some will thrive in these conditions and some simply won't. In my opinion, it's always worth giving it a go. Some of the moss is sliding and not staying in place, so I'm going to use some toothpicks to pin it down. Instead of covering the entire scape with just one species of moss, I've left lots of gaps where I can add another. This is some sphagnum moss that I've grown myself, and I think it will look great growing in patches throughout the Paludarium. In my opinion, using multiple different species will always help create a more natural looking scape. With all the moss planted in, the Paludarium has really come to life. These are some small pieces of Anubias and Bucephalandra. I'm going to plant these in right around the waterline, and they should add some nice detail to the base of the Paludarium. This here is some Christmas moss. It's an aquatic species that I think will look great growing in the water. I'd usually tie it to some stones or glue it to the hardscape, but this time I'm simply going to wedge it in between the rocks. I wasn't going to plant any more plants into the moss, but I think I'll make an exception for this oak leaf creeping fig. I think its dark green leaves and climbing tendencies will add some nice detail to the higher areas of the scape. To plant it, I'm simply pressing it down onto the damp moss, and it should send its roots down and start spreading in no time at all. After adding some floating plants to give the surface of the water a bit more detail, all that's left to do is let the Paludarium establish before introducing some life. It hasn't been too long since I set this tank up, but for now it seems to be doing great. I have introduced a small group of cherry shrimp into the water. They're only about a month or so old, so they are super small, but they seem to be doing really well. I won't keep them in here long term, as I think they'll need a bit more room once they're fully grown, but it's going to be perfect to watch them grow out. I have added a small guard on the intake of the filter just to make sure no shrimp get sucked up. The dripping water has kept the moss nice and hydrated, which is great. Let's just hope it continues to thrive. I really hope you enjoyed this build, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.